$2 billion vanished without a trace until a black female attorney walked into Congress carrying one folder, one USB drive, and 72 hours without sleep. What made the entire hearing committee rise to their feet in applause, and a federal judge tremble so badly he couldn't stand? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was early autumn in Washington, D.C., and everything looked calm on the surface. A secret ruling had been leaked, one that exposed a shocking truth. $2 billion in domestic aid meant for struggling American communities had been quietly sent overseas. No approval from Congress, no signature from the president. Just one man, Judge James Boasberg, acting alone. No one could believe it. This money was meant to rebuild hurricane-hit towns, help homeless veterans, and fix broken hospitals. Instead, it vanished into foreign accounts, signed away with the stroke of a judge's pen. The media covered the basics, but no one asked real questions. Not one senator called for an investigation. Even watchdog groups stayed silent. Boasberg was too powerful, too protected, and no one wanted to challenge him, except one woman, Jasmine Crockett. The storm had begun, and at its center was Jasmine Crockett, silent, focused, and about to become the name every powerful man in Washington would remember. While the city pretended nothing had happened, she was already preparing for war. She didn't give interviews. She didn't make noise. Jasmine vanished from public view, but not from the battlefield. For 72 hours, she buried herself in a flood of classified aid reports, emergency judicial rulings, and obscure financial memos that read like riddles carved in legal stone. She cross-referenced transfer codes with judicial timestamps, uncovering not just a paper trail, but a pattern of betrayal. Pages lined the walls of her office like a murder scene, each one a piece of a puzzle that no one else had the nerve to solve. Boasberg hadn't just moved money, he'd moved it strategically, cloaked beneath legal language no one had dared challenge. Jasmine read deeper, faster, sharper. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. But by the third sunrise, her eyes weren't red from exhaustion. They were burning with purpose. She had built a case strong enough to break a judge. When she walked into the Capitol that morning, no one recognized what was coming, but they felt it. Her stride was measured, precise, like a soldier entering enemy territory. No cameras followed her. No reporters shouted her name. In her right hand, she carried a single black binder. In her left coat pocket, a USB, silent but loaded. The guards let her pass without question, sensing something in her silence they couldn't explain. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't pause for greetings. She moved like someone who had already won, because she knew what the others didn't. The truth was no longer on Boasberg's side. The chamber was quiet when she arrived. Lawmakers whispered behind folders, pretending not to look. Jasmine sat down, slowly placed the binder on the table, and waited. Every move was deliberate, calculated. The room seemed colder, tighter. Even the sound of the chair's gavel felt hollow as the session opened. When Jasmine stood, her presence alone silenced the room. She didn't glance at the cameras. She didn't clear her throat. She looked dead ahead with eyes like tempered steel and said, in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, "I didn't come here to talk. I came here to end this." She didn't ease into it. She didn't ask politely. Jasmine Crockett pointed across the chamber like a prosecutor delivering the final blow and locked eyes with the man seated in judicial confidence behind polished oak and layers of arrogance. "Do you believe," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade through silk, "that you have the authority to overrule the President of the United States?" The room froze. Even the hum of the central air seemed to stop. Judge James Boasberg didn't flinch. He leaned back slightly, resting one arm across the bench, and smirked, a smirk practiced over years of unchecked power. "I acted," he said coolly, "within the law. But Jasmine wasn't here to dance with words or chase logic down rabbit holes. She was here to drag the truth into the light, and she had no intention of letting him hide behind robes and rhetoric." Her lips tightened. She took a single step forward, not aggressive, but inevitable. "The law," she repeated, her tone low and dangerous. "Show me where the law gives you the power to take $2 billion meant for this country, for our veterans, our cities, our people, and send it overseas without a vote, without a hearing, without even a signature from the commander-in-chief. Boasberg opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Not yet. Jasmine pressed forward, one sentence at a time, each word landing like a verdict. You used an emergency provision written for wartime sabotage to reallocate humanitarian aid. You redefined judicial discretion to mean unchecked dominion. You made a ruling behind closed doors and never thought you'd have to explain it. Her voice rose, not in volume but in weight. That's not justice. That's not law. That's power without restraint. And you abused it. The silence that followed wasn't stillness. It was pressure, building like a fault line ready to snap. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, eyes darting nervously between Jasmine and Boasberg. Even those who had doubted her now saw the cracks beginning to show. Boasberg adjusted his robe, then his tie. But Jasmine didn't blink. She had put him on the stand, in the one place where power has nowhere left to hide, under oath, in public, with the truth pressing down like a closing fist. She didn't pause to let them recover. Jasmine Crockett flipped the first page of her binder and held it up like a blade. "Let's begin with the International Forward Relief Coalition," she said, her tone razor-sharp. "On paper, they're based in Luxembourg, but their filings, what little there are, list a shell address in Malta. Their executive board includes 2 former officials flagged in an IMF corruption report. In 2018, they received $38 million in EU humanitarian aid. Only $9 million was ever accounted for. And now, under Judge Boasberg's order, they've received $460 million overnight." She slammed the document on the table. "And no one reviewed it. No one audited it. No one even asked where it went." Then came Unity Aid Foundation. Jasmine turned to page 2. Registered in Cyprus. Their operational headquarters? A converted apartment in Bucharest with no full-time staff and a disconnected phone line. She looked up. They received $280 million. She let that number hang, then added almost coldly, "One of their directors was arrested in 2020 for money laundering connected to arms trafficking in northern Syria." Someone in the back of the room audibly choked. Jasmine didn't flinch. "This is where our money went. Not to hurricane victims in Louisiana, not to the Navajo Nation struggling without water infrastructure, to ghost foundations and international intermediaries with deeper rap sheets than resumes." She moved to the third document, the Eastern Human Trust. On paper, it's a humanitarian outreach initiative, but their last known report, filed 6 years ago, was a single-page budget request with no breakdown of activity, no receipts, and no verification of field operations. And yet, she turned toward the committee, they were wired $510 million, $500 million, signed off by one man, without a single public hearing. The room had shifted. Eyes that had been skeptical were now wide open. Staffers whispered. One senator leaned forward, gripping his pen like it was a lifeline. Jasmine kept going. She was in full control now, not of emotion, but of undeniable fact. She pulled up Document 4, World Recovery Front. "Currently under active investigation by Interpol," she stated, "not only for financial irregularities, but for their suspected role in funneling resources to armed groups in West Africa. The only reason they haven't been formally indicted is because their structure is so complex. Even the Swiss regulators can't follow the money trail." Her voice sharpened. "But Judge Boasberg could, and he sent them $375 million. She was now holding the final page. "And lastly, the HELP network," she said, almost with bitter irony, "supposedly a child nutrition NGO based out of Geneva. But in 2021, they were found to have inflated refugee population reports by over 60%, misappropriating funds and falsifying field reports. Not only did the UN sever ties, but they were disqualified from every major aid program in Europe. And yet this court," she turned sharply toward Boasberg, "wired them $420 million in the name of justice." She let the 5 documents rest on the table like bodies at a crime scene. "None of these organizations have passed a U.S. Treasury audit. None of them have verified spending reports. 2 of them are on federal watch lists. And yet, Your Honor," she said, her words cutting the air with the elegance of a scalpel, "you overruled Congress, bypassed the president, and handed over $2 billion of taxpayer money to entities that could not survive a single background check at a state-level nonprofit registry. She stepped closer to the committee table. These weren't judgment calls. These were transactions, executed in darkness, with no oversight, no accountability, and no shame. She let her voice drop, slow and heavy. That money was earmarked for housing projects in Ohio, for school repairs in Detroit, for medical relief in Mississippi. Real Americans, real families, real needs. Her hand pressed down firmly on the table. They didn't get it, but Boasberg's 5 front organizations did. And now, no one can even tell you where the money is. The room was paralyzed. One of the committee aides stopped typing mid-keystroke. The air was thick, so thick you could almost hear hearts pounding beneath suit jackets. Even the cameramen stopped adjusting their lenses. Jasmine didn't have to scream. She had become a force of controlled devastation. Boasberg's face, once stoic, now showed the smallest twitch at the corner of his mouth, barely visible, but Jasmine caught it, and she smiled, just barely. It happened in a flicker, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Judge James Boasberg's composure cracked. For the first time since the hearing began, he shifted in his seat. His fingers gripped the edge of the desk just a little too tightly. His breath caught just a little too audibly. Then his voice, calculated, firm, but strained, cut through the tension. These claims, he said, eyes darting across the committee, are exaggerated. They are selectively presented to create doubt where none is warranted. But the words didn't land the way he intended. His tone had lost its polish. It sounded defensive, rattled. Jasmine didn't even flinch. She didn't need to reply. His unraveling was the answer. Still, Boasberg pushed forward, his volume rising. This is nothing more than a coordinated attempt to discredit me. These documents, these accusations, are designed to smear my record. He gestured toward the evidence on the table like it was poison, not paper. You're being manipulated, he said, voice rising further, cracking at the edge. This is an ambush, not a hearing. There are safeguards in place, systems that validate my decisions. Jasmine took a quiet step forward, her presence slicing through his monologue like ice through smoke. Boasberg turned toward her, his face now flushed, his jaw tight with panic masked as outrage. I want it on record, he snapped, that I categorically deny these claims. I've acted with integrity, always. This is a witch hunt. His words tumbled out faster than his control could contain them. And the more he spoke, the more power slipped from his grasp, like sand through trembling fingers. The room wasn't buying it. The committee members sat motionless, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief to something far more dangerous: awareness. They were watching a man implode under the weight of his own false confidence. Jasmine let him speak. She didn't interrupt. She let the fire burn out on its own. Because in that moment, Boasberg wasn't just losing control of the hearing, he was losing the illusion of authority he had worn like armor for years. And now the robe was slipping. The truth was showing. And he couldn't cover it fast enough. The silence in the chamber was suffocating. Jasmine stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the thick binder, like it was an anchor holding her steady in the eye of a storm. Her voice broke the silence. Not loud, but sharp and surgical, the kind of voice that makes people lean in and brace for impact. $2 billion, she said slowly, her eyes never leaving Judge Boasberg, could have rebuilt every school torn apart by hurricanes from Louisiana to Puerto Rico. Her tone darkened. It could have housed veterans sleeping on concrete floors beneath bridges in Baltimore, in Phoenix, in Des Moines. She took a step forward. It could have repaired the black mold-infested walls of children's hospitals in Detroit. She didn't blink. But instead, you sent it to people who don't even know what America looks like. People who've never bled for this flag. People who see our pain as a line item and our democracy as a loophole. The words didn't just sting. They struck. Then she moved. Jasmine grabbed the binder and slammed it onto the desk with a sound that echoed like a gavel falling from the heavens. Papers jumped. Lawmakers flinched. Boasberg's head jerked slightly, caught off guard not by the volume, but by the finality. Justice, she said, her voice cold as steel, is not a robe. It is responsibility. She stared straight through him. You don't get to hide behind tradition while bleeding this country dry from the bench. You don't get to wear the symbol of justice while betraying the very people it's supposed to protect. Her hands pressed into the binder, as if holding back the fire she refused to unleash in rage. That robe doesn't make you immune, she said. It makes you accountable. Judge Boasberg didn't respond. His mouth was closed, his eyes locked on the edge of the desk. But his hands, they were shaking. Barely, subtly, but unmistakably. The man who moments ago had wielded the weight of judicial authority now sat still, flushed and small beneath the weight of truth. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The cracks had started to show, not in marble, not in wood, but in the fragile armor Boasberg had built from years of silence, privilege, and unchecked power. And now, piece by piece, that armor was crumbling. But truth alone wasn't enough. Not this time. Jasmine wasn't just here to reveal injustice. She was here to expose the engine behind it, to show that what Boasberg had done wasn't merely immoral, it was profitable. She struck with precision. No theatrics, no build-up, just cold, irrefutable truth. Jasmine reached into her binder and removed a final envelope, slimmer than the rest, but far deadlier. This, she said, unfolding the contents with calm authority, is a registered trust account located in the Cayman Islands, titled under Daniel T. Boasberg, the nephew of Judge James Boasberg. Her voice echoed through the chamber like a verdict. The trust was opened 91 days after your sealed ruling redirected $2 billion in aid funds. She raised her eyes. And 21 days after that, it received a deposit of $12 million? She let the words hang like a guillotine above the room. The source of that deposit? One of the international aid groups your ruling directly benefited to the tune of $400 million. The transaction was disguised, routed through a Swiss intermediary, and processed under a shell name, Eastlight Global Services. But we traced it. Her hand tightened on the paper. And it leads right back to you. Gasps broke out, quiet but raw, like the first drops of a storm slamming on glass. Some members of the committee leaned forward. Others sat frozen, the weight of realization sinking in. Jasmine continued, unwavering. We're not talking about oversight anymore. This isn't negligence. This is structured, coordinated, intentional. She stepped away from the table, holding up a photocopy of the transfer record. This is how corruption wears a robe in America, she said. It doesn't steal in the night. It signs sealed orders in daylight and hides behind courtroom walls. Her tone turned sharper, heavier. You didn't break the law, Judge. You manipulated it, twisted it, turned it into a weapon to enrich your own blood while your decisions destroyed the safety net millions of Americans depend on. Boasberg said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than any outburst. His eyes dropped to the floor. His hands no longer fidgeted. They clung, white-knuckled, to the edge of his bench as if trying to hold together the last fragments of his reputation. Jasmine stared directly at him, her voice quiet but blistering. You didn't just abuse your authority, you commodified justice. You made a market out of suffering, and you did it with full knowledge that the system would protect you until someone finally dared to look deeper. Her final line landed like a closing gavel. You didn't violate the law, Judge Boasberg. You exploited it. To get rich. The impact hit the room like a silent explosion. Chairs shifted. Pens dropped. Eyes that had once been glazed over with political indifference now widened with something far more dangerous. Recognition. The members of the committee, seasoned veterans of hearings and scandals, sat frozen in a kind of horrified awe. One congressman stared blankly at the banking documents in front of him, mouthing the numbers without sound as if trying to convince himself he had misread them. Another, an older senator with 40 years of service, let his reading glasses slide to the edge of his nose, unable to lift them again. A third leaned back slowly in his seat, his face pale, eyes locked on Jasmine, as if he were witnessing a woman do what no one else had dared. Pull the curtain back on the most sacred, protected corner of government. Shock rippled into anger. A low voice from the far end of the bench muttered, "This can't be real." But no one contradicted it. One member slammed his hand on the table, not in aggression, but disbelief, muttering, My God. Another whispered to his aide, urgently scribbling notes as if trying to catch up with a reality that had already sprinted past them. The atmosphere shifted from observation to alarm. No longer were they watching a hearing. They were standing in the middle of a historic collapse. Jasmine had detonated something no one expected to crumble: the illusion of untouchability. Every face in the chamber reflected the same truth. Boasberg wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a scandal, and every second they sat silent made them part of it. She didn't flinch. She didn't warn them. Jasmine Crockett stepped forward with the calm of a surgeon and the precision of a soldier. Her fingers gripped a small black USB like it was a trigger. She crossed to the media console in the corner of the chamber, normally used for slideshow charts or dull-budget graphs, and without asking for permission, plugged it in. A low chime echoed through the room. The committee screen flickered. Jasmine tapped a single key. Then she stepped back, folded her arms, and faced the crowd with a look that said, "Watch this." The screen came to life, grainy but clear. The timestamp in the upper left corner read, 10:37 a.m., August 14th. The audio kicked in with a quiet hum. A camera angle taken from the upper corner of a courthouse hallway revealed a man in a gray blazer standing near a locked office door. He was speaking in a hushed but steady tone to another man in a dark coat holding a leather briefcase. Jasmine turned her eyes to the committee but said nothing. Then the audio sharpened, and the words landed like a sniper round through marble. Boasberg said he needs his piece wired before he signs anything. The man in the coat didn't argue. He nodded, unzipped his briefcase, and slid over a slim folder. 12. Same routing as before. The room didn't erupt at first. It cracked, like something sacred had just been defiled. A gasp came from the second row. One senator clutched the edge of his chair and muttered, "Jesus Christ." A female congresswoman's pen slipped from her fingers, landing noiselessly on the floor. The committee chair leaned forward with an expression of disbelief that bordered on fear. The video ended, and the screen went black. No dramatic music, no final frame. Just silence, so thick it smothered the room. Jasmine stood still. She didn't move, didn't explain, didn't offer commentary. She didn't need to. The facts were no longer on paper. They were alive, visual, audible, and deadly. For 30 seconds, no one in the chamber dared speak. And in that space, Jasmine's presence expanded like a storm cloud ready to split the room in two. Then slowly, she stepped back toward the center of the floor. Her voice was calm, but now every syllable felt like a sentence being read aloud in court. "This wasn't an opinion," she said. "This wasn't a theory. It wasn't a misinterpretation of the law." She paused. "This was a transaction, arranged in the hallways of justice, a price tag placed on a ruling, and a demand made before the signature." She looked directly at Boasberg. "You sold a ruling, and you did it on camera." Boasberg looked like a man on the edge of collapse. His mouth opened, but there was no sound. His jaw twitched. His fingers trembled against the wood of the table. That arrogant posture, shoulders back, chin high, was gone. What remained was a man stripped of myth, trapped in evidence, and exposed for the fraud he had always assumed no one would catch. Jasmine continued. "The $12 million from World Recovery Front didn't just appear in your nephew's offshore trust. It didn't magically navigate 3 international banks and land in the Caymans on a coincidence. It landed there because you asked for it to, because you demanded it." She let her words sink like weights in the stillness. "And now the question is no longer whether you abused your power. It's whether this body," she gestured to the committee, "has the spine to hold a judge accountable for a crime every American would face prison for without hesitation." At the back of the room, a reporter whispered, "He's finished." Another simply nodded, never taking their eyes off Boasberg. Across the chamber, aides were already typing, phones buzzing with texts to legal counsel, press teams, and federal investigators. Jasmine looked around the room and saw what she needed. No one was defending him anymore. No one could. She stepped forward once more, her voice quiet now, not to strike, but to bury. "You thought no one would look. You thought your robes would protect you. But justice isn't a costume. It's not a performance. It's accountability. And today it came wearing heels and carrying a flash drive. He snapped. Like a man watching the last rope slip from his hands, Judge Boasberg surged to his feet, voice rising in panic disguised as outrage. "That video is fake!" he barked, his face red, breath quick. "It's been doctored. This is slander. This is illegal." His words bounced off the chamber walls, but no one was reaching to mute the footage or dismiss the evidence. No one moved to defend him. The unraveling had begun, and Jasmine didn't blink. She waited, silent, precise, letting the outburst echo into emptiness before stepping forward with something far colder than fury: proof. From her briefcase, she drew a white folder stamped with the seal of the U.S. Judicial Security Office and slid it onto the desk with quiet finality. "This," she said firmly, "is the uncut footage, retrieved directly from the internal surveillance system of the D.C. Federal Courthouse, chain of custody verified, time-stamped, encrypted with a 3-key justice authentication protocol." Her voice cut like frost. "There are only 2 people in the country with clearance to access that footage. One of them is me." She opened the folder slowly, revealing a printed screenshot from the video. Frame-by-frame breakdown, time logs, and at the top, the internal tracking code. Boasberg froze mid-breath. Jasmine leaned closer, her voice low but sharp enough to slice through the marble columns. "Video can lie, Judge, but your signature doesn't." She flipped to the final page. Page 14, line 12 of the NGO authorization agreement. Signed by you. Dated the same day as the transfer, notarized, witnessed, and filed under sealed record until I pulled it from the archives this morning. There was no more shouting, no more denials. Only the sound of silence, the kind that falls not out of respect, but from the shock of realizing the curtain has been ripped away and there's nothing behind it but guilt. Boasberg sat down slowly, as if gravity had doubled in that moment. His hands, once clenched in righteous indignation, now rested uselessly on the table. The power he once wielded like a weapon had evaporated under the weight of his own signature, his own proof of betrayal. Jasmine turned toward the committee, her voice not triumphant, but solemn. "You've seen the footage. You've read the documents. This hearing is no longer about policy. It's about consequence." Then she paused, eyes scanning the chamber one last time. "The battle in this room is over, but the war for justice, it's only beginning." Judge James Boasberg tried to stand, but his knees betrayed him. He gripped the edge of the table with both hands, knuckles bone white, arms trembling under the weight of his own disgrace. His face, once flushed with arrogance and authority, had gone ghost pale, drained of all color, as if the blood itself had abandoned him. His lips parted, then shut again, unable to form words. His eyes darted across the chamber, not to find help, but to confirm what he already knew. There was no one left to defend him. The silence in the room was no longer tense. It was surgical, like a scalpel holding the air still as it cut away everything he had built. Jasmine stood tall just feet away, unwavering, unflinching, while Boasberg shook under the spotlight of accountability. The man who once ruled from the bench with unchecked power now stood as a broken figure, shrinking under the weight of truth. Even the robe on his shoulders seemed too heavy, like it no longer belonged to him. And in that moment, he wasn't a judge. He was just a man, cornered and collapsing in slow motion before the eyes of a nation. The silence was suffocating, thick, electric, alive. It hung for only a few seconds, but it felt like the entire room was holding its breath, suspended between what had just been revealed and what had to come next. Then, like a thunderclap tearing through stone, it happened. "Mr. Chairman, enough," a voice roared from the far right of the chamber. Representative Alden Graves, silver-haired, steel-spined, former JAG officer turned congressional pitbull, rose to his feet with the fury of a man who had just watched the Constitution set on fire. His chair slammed backward, and every eye snapped to him. The gavel hadn't moved. No one had called on him. He didn't care. "I am calling, here and now, for the immediate formation of a federal investigative committee," he declared, voice echoing across the marble walls like the crack of a rifle. "Effective today, not tomorrow, not next week, now." Papers rustled. Some aides dropped their pens. Jasmine didn't move, Her face was still, but inside she knew. The walls were finally closing in. Graves continued, his voice building, hands planted firmly on the table as if he were holding the system itself steady. What we just witnessed is not judicial overreach. It is corruption, engineered, executed, and profited from. This is fraud. This is racketeering, and it happened under the shield of one of the highest offices in the land. He turned toward his colleagues, fire in his eyes. If this chamber fails to act now, if we look the other way, stall for process, bury this under bureaucracy, then we become complicit. Every dollar that was stolen, every American that went unhelped, every ruling sold behind closed doors, we will own it. His voice dropped, lower, but somehow even heavier. This is a test of who we are, not as politicians, but as stewards of a republic. He looked directly at Boasberg, who still sat slumped in disbelief, paling by the second. And I, for one, refuse to serve in a Congress that bows to corruption disguised in black robes. A hush fell again, but it was no longer hesitation. It was transformation. One by one, heads nodded. Eyes met across the room. Democrats, Republicans, independents. Divides that had once seemed permanent vanished in the shadow of something larger. Staffers began moving, not frantically, but with focused urgency. Phones buzzed, laptops opened. A senior aide whispered into a microphone, clipped beneath his collar. Activate legal response protocol. Jasmine still said nothing, but her eyes flickered with a fire that had waited years to be seen. The machine of government, the part that moves slowly, quietly, reluctantly, had finally turned. And now it was rolling forward with the force of accountability in its purest, rawest form. This wasn't just emotion. It wasn't just politics. It was a reckoning. And James Boasberg, pale, trembling, and silent, had just become its first target. She stood there, motionless, not triumphant, not smiling, just still, like a blade held in perfect balance. The chamber, once filled with chatter and disbelief, had gone silent again. Not out of respect, but from the weight of knowing they had all just witnessed something irreversible. Jasmine Crockett looked out across the room, at the men and women who had doubted her, dismissed her, tried to rush her testimony just hours ago. Some of them now sat pale, others trembling, many unable to meet her gaze. But she didn't come here to bask in their silence. She came to explain what that silence had cost. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unshakable. If I hadn't come here today, she began, each word slow, heavy, soaked in the gravity of what she had just unearthed. The money would have vanished, again, quietly, without headlines, without hearings, just like it did last time, just like it did the time before that. She paused, eyes narrowing, not with anger, but with precision. It would have disappeared into the same dark places, the same untraceable shell accounts, the same fake nonprofits, the same hands holding the same briefcases, smiling in the same marble hallways. She stepped forward just once, her heels echoing like gavel strikes on concrete. And you, every one of you, would have called it unfortunate. You would have told the American people it was a policy dispute, a budgeting error, maybe a matter of interpretation. Her tone sharpened. You would have buried it in subcommittees, smothered it in red tape, and waited for the news cycle to move on. The room remained breathless. No one interrupted. No one dared. She looked down at the long wooden table between them, polished, elegant, and in her eyes complicit. If I hadn't been here, she continued, voice quieter now but loaded with force, justice wouldn't just have been delayed. It would have been buried. Her hand pressed lightly against the wood. Buried beneath this very table, the same table where you sign resolutions, the same table where you swear oaths, the same table that has witnessed decades of hearings that never led anywhere. Because this time, just like so many times before, there was no one willing to stand here and say, enough. She looked straight at the chairman now, then let her eyes sweep across the entire row. You don't need another task force. You don't need more talking points. What you need is courage, because you know what I know. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a blueprint, A system designed to funnel public trust into private pockets and shield those responsible behind robes, rulings, and legal fog. And you would have let it pass again, because it was easier, because it was safer. Jasmine paused again, but this time not to let her words sink in, this time to let the weight of truth itself settle in the room. Her next words came colder, sharper, final. I didn't come here to make noise. I didn't come here to perform. I came here because no one else would. Because when everyone else was afraid of Boasberg's power, I looked at the receipts. Because when your staffers told me this would end my career, I opened the sealed files. And when the system told me I didn't have the authority to question a sitting federal judge, she leaned in. Her voice dropped to a whisper that sliced like steel. I did it anyway. Then she straightened, her tone turning solemn again, measured but heavier than anything else in the room. If I hadn't come here today, the American people would have lost more than $2 billion. They would have lost something they can never afford to lose again. The belief that justice can still speak, that it can still act, that it can still rise from the silence. She turned her head slightly, as if addressing not just the chamber, but the country watching beyond its walls. But not today, not on my watch, not while I'm still breathing. And when Jasmine finally stepped back, there was no applause, only silence, because everyone in that room knew the most damning truth of all. She was right. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to spin. The documents had been shown. The signature had matched. The video had spoken. And the man in the black robe, once untouchable, now sat like a statue eroding under floodlights. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not yet. She turned back toward Judge Boasberg, her eyes as steady as ever, voice clear, but now tinged with finality. The kind of tone that only arrives when justice is about to close the door. No one, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a final verdict, is above the law. Not even you, who sits on a seat built for justice, but carries a heart full of greed. Boasberg's head hung lower now, his eyes barely able to meet hers. He looked hollowed out, like a man whose world had been pulled out from beneath his feet and replaced with a noose. His robe, once a symbol of authority, now looked heavy, ill-fitting, like it no longer belonged to him, because it didn't. Then it happened. A sharp voice rang out from the center left of the committee. Chairwoman Elena Mendez, a veteran legislator with decades of courtroom discipline behind her eyes, stood and raised her hand. Madam Clerk, she called with firm precision, summon the U.S. Federal Judicial Enforcement Division. I am issuing an emergency judicial detainment order to be carried out immediately. Gasps ricocheted around the chamber. The words had been said. Official, irrevocable. The moment the handcuffs entered the room, the oxygen changed. It wasn't just the weight of metal. It was the weight of justice finally arriving, after years of silence. 2 U.S. federal judicial enforcement officers moved like shadows with purpose, flanking the aisle as if walking into a battlefield already won. They didn't speak to the cameras. They didn't look at the lawmakers. Their eyes were locked only on one man, Judge James Boasberg. One carried a sealed indictment folder stamped with red initials, HSA/N TC-01, National Threat Classification, Level 1. The other held a digital scanner linked to the DOJ criminal ledger, already activated, awaiting one fingerprint. They weren't here to investigate. They were here to execute a federal order, on live record. Boasberg's shoulders slumped the second he saw them. There was no more fight, no pretense. The man who had once ruled from behind a bench now looked small, not in stature, but in soul. His lips quivered. His hands, once used to deliver verdicts with cold precision, now lay helpless in front of him as the officer approached. A single sentence was read aloud, with the cold authority of law. James Daniel Boasberg, by order of the United States House Judicial Oversight Committee and under Title 18 of the U.S. Code, you are under arrest. The list began, crisp and clear. For abuse of judicial authority, conspiracy to commit international money laundering, misuse of federal appropriations, violation of national financial security infrastructure, and high treason against the United States government. Cameras flashed in a frenzy. Reporters stood from their seats, jaws slack, hands trembling as they tried to capture the moment through fogging lenses. Some lawmakers sat frozen, others whispered in disbelief, no longer questioning what they were seeing, but how it had gone unnoticed for so long. Boasberg said nothing. He didn't protest. When the cuffs closed around his wrists, his body gave a slight shudder, not from pain, but from the weight of reality finally crashing in. The metallic click echoed like a gunshot in a cathedral. His robe bunched at his waist, hanging like a shroud as two officers guided him to his feet. For a moment he swayed, no longer a man of the law, but a relic of everything it had failed to stop. Until now. The officer holding the digital scanner stepped forward. "Confirming biometric signature for entry into federal custody," he said. Boasberg's thumb was pressed onto the screen. It beeped once, then turned green. The system didn't even hesitate. A second officer opened the sealed folder and read the formal sentencing recommendation aloud for the record. The accused faces life imprisonment at ADX Florence Federal Penitentiary, without possibility of parole, without eligibility for commutation or executive pardon. The chamber erupted, not in applause, not in celebration, but in motion. Dozens of staffers scrambled to update statements. Federal legal liaisons called for armored transport. One news anchor was already live on air, voice shaking. "We are witnessing an unprecedented event, the arrest of a sitting federal judge inside the very halls of government he once controlled." But amidst it all, Jasmine didn't move. She didn't speak. Her expression was still carved from steel, because she wasn't here to gloat. She hadn't come for revenge. She had come for truth, and now that truth stood in chains before a room full of people who had once believed power made someone untouchable. Jasmine had proven them wrong. Justice had spoken. And this time, it was louder than corruption. For a full second, no one moved. Then it hit, a wave. It started with a gasp, then a burst of applause from the far right bench, followed by another, and then the entire room ignited. Lawmakers stood, hands crashing together, raw and unscripted. Some pounded the table. Others simply stared at Jasmine with a kind of reverence, as if they were seeing something they had forgotten existed, a woman unbought, unbent, unafraid. The applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous, primal, a release of pressure built over decades of silent compromise. Reporters scrambled to reposition, their voices tumbling over each other in breathless updates. Federal judge arrested in live hearing. Yes, on camera. Yes, in handcuffs. The cameras, mounted on rails, shoulder-mounted, handheld, swung like storm-battered sails, capturing every flash of movement, every shocked face, every raised fist of vindication. Even the ones who had doubted her, those who rolled their eyes when she first walked in, who whispered that she was grandstanding, reaching too far, now stood to applaud. One aide in the back wiped tears from her cheek. Another muttered a stunned prayer beneath his breath. And amid the frenzy, a middle-aged congressman leaned toward the colleague next to him, his voice low, cracked with disbelief. "I thought this kind of thing only happened in the movies." He wasn't trying to be funny. He was just trying to believe what he had just seen. Jasmine turned toward him, her face still calm, not cold but forged, like steel straight from fire. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, but in that room it felt louder than every hand clapping. "No," she said, eyes locked on his, her words slow, deliberate, like scripture. "This is real America, and real America doesn't need perfection. It needs courage. It needs people willing to say no, to money, to power, to darkness, even when it wears a black robe and signs its name in gold ink." The room fell still again, not out of shock this time, but respect. A long, reverent silence followed her words, as if even the noise knew it had to step aside for what had just been said. And in that silence, something shifted. Not just the room, but the institution itself. No longer just a building where questions were asked, but now, for the first time in a long time, a place where truth was answered. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply stood still, the storm behind her, the future ahead. Because in that moment, everyone understood the same thing. Justice had not only survived the darkness, it had stood up, spoken out, and put handcuffs on it. The gavel never fell, but the nation did. Not into chaos, but into clarity. In the 24 hours after Boasberg was arrested, something rare happened in America. Silence gave way to reckoning. Jasmine Crockett's name wasn't just trending, it was everywhere. Her confrontation in the chamber looped on cable news, talk radio, and front pages coast to coast. Networks didn't cut it into sound bites. They aired her entire speech, raw and uninterrupted. From classrooms to courtrooms, people watched her call out a judge to his face, dismantle his lies with federal code, and then step back while justice, real justice, put on the cuffs. It was the kind of moment America had forgotten it was capable of. And Jasmine? She didn't run from it. She carried it like she had carried everything else. Quietly, deliberately, with fire under the surface. In Chicago, a mural appeared overnight. Jasmine in grayscale, eyes narrowed. The word enough painted in crimson across the bricks. In Birmingham, civil rights veterans gathered at a community center just to re-watch the hearing and cry. One woman stood and whispered, "It's been decades since I saw someone that brave in that building." In Montana, a trucker turned off his CB radio mid-haul to listen to Jasmine's final words on replay, whispering, "Damn right," when she said, "Real America needs people who say no to the dark." Her words didn't divide, they pierced through the divisions. And in a nation so often fractured, Jasmine Crockett had somehow become the rarest kind of mirror, one that didn't flatter but revealed. Veterans wrote letters, thousands. One, a Marine in Georgia, wrote, "We fought for a system we believed in. Thank you for reminding us that it's still worth fighting for." A public school teacher in Jackson posted a video online, holding back tears as she told her class, "This is what courage looks like. This is what it means to stand for the truth when it's dangerous." Her students, barely old enough to vote, watched the full hearing on a smartboard. Jasmine's quiet composure, her refusal to yell or gloat, spoke louder than any speech ever could. They didn't just see a lawyer. They saw a woman who looked like them, black, composed, relentless, and untouchable by fear. Politicians scrambled to catch up. Some tried to co-opt her message. Others scrambled to distance themselves from Boasberg. But Jasmine, she didn't tour the networks. She didn't sell a book deal. She refused interviews for the first week. "Let the evidence speak," she said when asked. "My job was to expose the lie. Now it's their job to fix the system." Her restraint only added to the respect. This wasn't a woman chasing applause. This was a woman who forced accountability into motion and then refused to bask in the spotlight. She didn't just dismantle corruption, she rewrote the script. Universities invited her to speak. Law schools changed their syllabi to include the Crockett hearing. Civil rights groups created a task force modeled after her legal strategy, centered not on protest, but on precision. Former judges, yes, even them, spoke up. One retired justice from the Fifth Circuit admitted on a national podcast, "She did what none of us ever had the guts to do. She confronted the immunity we all pretended was just part of the job." That confession alone was front-page news. Meanwhile, across every major outlet, the questions began to shift. It was no longer, "How did Boasberg fall?" It was, "How many more like him exist?" Jasmine's work had ignited more than outrage. It awakened curiosity. Journalists dug deeper. Old rulings resurfaced. Millions in suspicious transfers were traced. For the first time in years, corruption wasn't just whispered about, it was hunted. And the public followed along, not out of bloodlust, but because they had seen something rare, proof that power could bleed. Still, Jasmine never made herself the center. When asked by a reporter if she felt like a hero, she answered flatly, "No. A hero makes things better. I just made things visible." Her humility wasn't performative. It was armor, forged in courtrooms where she'd once been the only black woman, the youngest voice, the one told to sit down. That history, those scars never left her. But they gave her something deeper than anger. They gave her resolve. In South Central Los Angeles, a mother held her 10-year-old daughter's hand and said, "That's who you can be. Not famous, powerful." In Houston, a pastor scrapped his sermon mid-week and built it around Jasmine's quote, "Justice isn't a robe. It's responsibility." The congregation stood mid-sermon and clapped, not because it was political, but because it was true. Online, a hashtag exploded, #sign Jasmine Standard. It wasn't about her style or her background. It was about the new expectations she had set. It meant accountability wasn't optional. It meant power couldn't hide behind robes or sealed chambers. And perhaps most important, it meant one voice, properly armed with truth, could shake a mountain. Not everyone praised her. Some called her too aggressive. Some whispered that she had disrespected the judiciary. But those voices didn't last. The facts were too loud, the footage too undeniable, and Jasmine's composure too strong to dismantle with spin. 1 week after the arrest, a conservative judge, normally silent on political matters, wrote an op-ed entitled, "Courage Looks Like Jasmine." It read, "She held the system to its own standards." She didn't demand more. She demanded exactly what the Constitution promises. And that scared people more than any speech ever could. In Washington, the Capitol was different now. Staffers whispered about the Crockett effect. Senior aides updated protocol for judicial review hearings. One senator pushed a bipartisan bill, the Federal Transparency and Ethics Act, nicknamed Jasmine's Law. It called for mandatory audits of judicial financials, a citizen oversight board, and the revocation of lifetime immunity for justices caught in active corruption. It didn't just get traction, it got votes. Yet amid all this, Jasmine stayed where she had always been, close to the ground, not in the sky. She walked to work. She declined security detail. "I'm not above the people I serve," she said. "If I ever act like I am, you'll know I've become what I fought." It wasn't a quote for effect, it was her code. And the country believed her because she had already proven what most people only post about. That one voice, if unshaken, can be louder than an empire of silence. She was invited to the White House. She stood beside the president in a press conference, introduced not as former prosecutor or congressional witness, but simply, the woman who reminded us all what justice looks like. The president said 7 words that would be repeated everywhere for months. She didn't restore trust. She earned it. That afternoon, the president handed her a plaque. Jasmine looked down at it and said, "I'll take this home. But what I really want is for every young lawyer out there, every black girl in law school, to know they can do this too, that they don't have to wait to be invited to fight for justice. They just have to show up. Ready." She walked off stage without fanfare. No fist pumps, no tears. Just that same fire-steady walk she had brought into the hearing room on day 1. Reporters called after her. Cameras followed. But Jasmine didn't stop, because this was never about her. It was about what came next. Across the country, change began. Not overnight, not easy, but visible. 2 more judges were placed under investigation. Congressional hearings became must-watch events, not because of drama, but because people believed something might actually happen now. And through it all, Jasmine's name didn't fade. It became the standard, the spark, the shorthand for what it means to stand when others sit, to speak when others stay safe. In a time when truth often felt optional, Jasmine Crockett proved it could still be a weapon, not forged in hatred, not thrown in rage, but wielded with purpose, precision, and the kind of quiet fury that doesn't demand attention, it earns it. She didn't become a celebrity. She became something far more dangerous to the status quo, a symbol that couldn't be owned. And that, more than the headlines, the applause, or the reforms, was what terrified those who clung to power. Because Jasmine didn't come to play the game. She came to rewrite the rules. After the gavel falls and the cameras stop, what remains is the echo. Not of applause, but of the moment that something changes. Not in law, but in the soul of a nation. That echo belonged to Jasmine Crockett, and it did not fade. Because her story wasn't a moment, it was a mirror. One held up to a system long shielded by silence, where power was mistaken for virtue and robes were confused for righteousness. And when she stepped into that room, alone and outnumbered, she didn't ask for permission. She pulled back the curtain, and America saw what was hiding in plain sight. But what makes her story truly unforgettable is not just the victory, It's the cost. It's what she endured to get there. Because before the lights, before the headline, before the cuffs on Boasberg's wrists, there were the nights Jasmine couldn't sleep. There were the files she read through burning eyes at 3 a.m. There were the voicemails warning her to back off, the emails marked confidential that shook her to her core. There were the silent meetings where colleagues looked the other way, the friends who said, "This isn't your fight," and still, she went in. Because for her, justice wasn't theory, it was a responsibility. What makes her story so vital, so painfully relevant, is that it wasn't extraordinary. It was possible, repeatable, human. She didn't fly in with press teams and legal armies. She didn't shout. She simply refused to lie. To the system, to the people, to herself. And that refusal, that quiet, uncompromising commitment to truth, proved more powerful than any institution standing in her way. But with that power came a truth America had long avoided. Injustice doesn't hide in shadows anymore. It wears robes, holds gavels, and smiles for the press. Jasmine didn't expose an outlier. She exposed a pattern. And in doing so, she forced every citizen to confront an uncomfortable fact: that silence is no longer innocent. It is the fuel of corruption. The moral of her story isn't comfortable. It demands something from us. It says, if you see the truth and walk away, you're not a bystander. You're a participant. Because Boasberg didn't rise alone. He rose with the help of every shrug, every "not my business," every deal made in the name of keeping the system stable. And Jasmine? She shattered that stability. She told the world, if the system only works for the powerful, it's not broken, it's rigged. Her story also forced America to re-examine its idea of justice. Not as something doled out from on high, but something fought for, preserved, and carried by people with no backup, no safety net, and no guarantee they'll win. That's what makes her a symbol. Not because she prevailed, but because she walked in knowing she might not, and did it anyway. The lesson isn't that Jasmine was fearless. It's that she was afraid and moved forward. It's that her hands shook, that her voice cracked in rehearsals, that she questioned herself more times than she could count. But the difference is, she kept showing up, even when it hurt, even when it cost her, even when it felt like no one else cared, because she understood a truth most people run from. Courage isn't loud, it's consistent. And in being consistent, she became something rare, a fixed point in a spinning world, a place the nation could look to and say, that, right there, is what we're supposed to be. Not perfect, not polished, but principled, unmoving, true. The impact, it didn't stop at the courtroom steps. It moved outward, like a shockwave. Veterans who once believed they'd been forgotten wrote letters again. Students who once felt politics was hopeless started registering to vote. Whistleblowers inspired by her example began stepping forward. In less than a month, 2 more federal investigations were launched. One congressional aide was caught saying, "We have to assume everything will be looked at now." Everything. That wasn't fear. That was the beginning of a culture shift. And still, Jasmine refused the spotlight. "I didn't do this to be remembered," she told a law school audience weeks later. "I did it so you could remember who you are." She didn't care about legacy. She cared about responsibility, about waking people up, about burning the idea that someone else would do the hard thing, because no one is coming. No one saves democracy. We either stand for it or we lose it. The real moral of Jasmine's story is this: it's not enough to believe in justice. You have to embody it, not when it's easy, when it's dangerous, when it costs you everything, when the room is against you, when the outcome is uncertain, when you'd rather look away. That's the test. That's where real character is revealed. Not in crisis, but in your willingness to enter it anyway. And what she taught us, what she forced the country to remember, is that you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be present, relentless, and unwilling to betray the truth. Her story is not about takedown, it's about restoration, not revenge, responsibility. And her quiet revolution, the one where she walked into that chamber and rewrote the ending, showed us that accountability is not a dream. It's a decision. It's not easy. It's not quick. It's not guaranteed. But it is possible. And perhaps most powerfully, it's contagious. Because now, thanks to Jasmine Crockett, thousands of others are rising. Some in courtrooms, some in classrooms, some at kitchen tables asking harder questions, some in boardrooms refusing to sign the check. Her fire didn't fade, it spread, not as chaos, but as clarity. And that clarity, that relentless belief that justice must bend toward truth, is the legacy no scandal can erase. This is the human lesson, that justice isn't just an ideal. It's a fight, a decision, a refusal, a choice made daily, not by perfect people, but by principled ones. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't just make that choice once. She made it again, and again, and again, until the world could no longer ignore it. You've watched the fall of power. You've seen what happens when one woman walks alone into a chamber of silence and dares to say what everyone else is afraid to whisper. You've seen robes shaken. You've seen justice drag itself up from the dirt and finally speak. But if you think this story ends here, if you think Jasmine Crockett's stand was the last stand, then you've missed the point entirely. This isn't the end. It's the opening shot, the warning flare, the line in the sand. Because Jasmine didn't win so we could sit back. She won so we could stand up. So now the question is no longer, what did she do? The question is, what will you do now? Will you let her voice be the only one? Will you let the next Boasberg rise because it's not your courtroom? Will you keep scrolling, keep shrugging, keep saying someone else will handle it, while truth gets buried again under headlines, excuses, and sealed files? Or will you remember? Will you remember that the system didn't protect us? A woman did. That the law didn't stop corruption? Someone brave enough to use it did. That nothing changes unless someone decides to make it impossible to look away. This is your moment, right here, not tomorrow, not when it feels easier. Now, because injustice doesn't wait, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't disappear, it evolves, it adapts, it finds new robes, new faces, new excuses, and it counts on your silence. It feeds on the comfort of good people who stay quiet. So don't give it what it needs. Speak, ask harder questions, demand accountability from those in robes and suits and microphones. Look into budgets, follow the money, show up at hearings, vote like the system is real, and then demand that it becomes real. Tell your children the truth. Teach them what Jasmine showed us, that justice isn't handed out. It's claimed, it's bled for, and it only survives if we're willing to defend it, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's lonely, even when it hurts. Start where you are, with what you have, in your office, in your school board, in your city council, at your dinner table. Stand up when the moment comes, because it will. It always does. And when it does, remember Jasmine. Remember how she stood, eyes locked, voice steady, spine unshaken, not because she was fearless, but because she was faithful to the truth. Be like that. Be inconvenient to corruption. Be disruptive to silence. Be unbearable to those who think the system exists to protect them, not serve you. Because you don't have to be famous. You don't have to be wealthy. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be unwilling to look away when justice is under attack. If one voice can do what Jasmine did, what could 10 do? 100? What could a nation of people finally paying attention accomplish? The answer is terrifying to those in power, which is exactly why you must begin. This is not a story. It's a signal, a call not to watch, but to act, not to admire, but to imitate. So here it is, the moment, the echo. Will you be silent or will you rise? Because the next chapter of this fight starts with you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.